and we are delighted tonight to be participating here with a panel of 4 people who I think exemplify in fabulous ways the challenging of the reigning assumptions. Laura Flanders, our moderator for tonight, is the host of Radio Nation on Air America. She is somebody who talks the talk as well as walking the walk, and she is both tremendously entertaining and a very, very serious host. She's also the author of Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species, about women in the Bush administration, and is writing a new book actually, which is about the progressive victories in unusual places and what we can learn and take from them. So I'm delighted to have Laura Flanders as our host. Next to Laura, we have Paul. Next to Laura, we have someone you all know who's Paul Krugman, who is the writer for the New York Times op-ed page. He's also a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton University, most recently the author of The Great Awakening, which many of you have seen. But interestingly enough, as we were talking...
Close enough.
What?
Good enough for government work.
The Great Unraveling.
There we go.
Wake up, Miles.
I gave you even more credit.
There we go.
He spawned an entire era. Anyway, The Great Unraveling, my apologies. But back in 1989, Paul said that he was writing about inequality in a book that he wrote called The Age of Diminished Expectations, and really has been calling attention to this issue for a long time. Meiju Louis is a wonderful activist, advocate, author, organizational person from Boston. Meiju started her work as a hospital worker and a union activist at Boston City Hospital, was the first Asian American elected to president of a union local in Boston and perhaps elsewhere, and since 1995 has been the director for United for a Fair Economy. And people may know that United for a Fair Economy has done just incredible work on challenging the rollback, the repeal of the estate tax, really getting even people like Bill Gates Sr. and others to speak out about the need for the public structures that are supported by the tax dollars that people pay. So Meiju is the author of a forthcoming book called The Color of Wealth, which is coming out, published by the New Press very shortly, and she will be speaking tonight. And last but not least is Jim Lardner, who's the senior fellow at Demos on inequality issues, and who is the co-editor, along with David Smith, another senior fellow at Demos who is here tonight, of Inequality Matters. Jim really has been passionate and articulate on this issue for the last several years as a writer for the New York Times magazine and for many, many other publications, and actually founded a website called inequality.org, which has now become part of the Demos family. So we've got a great panel tonight. I guarantee you you'll hear some things that you won't hear at any other point this evening. And so let me introduce Laura Flanders. Laura?
All right, thank you, everybody. I'm very glad to see you and not that other guy in front of me tonight. I'm Laura Flanders, and I don't know what our president is going to hallucinate this evening, but we, in the reality-based community, know that the state of our union really is not. We don't have a union. We have, at this point, a tiny minority who are earning more wealth than they can reasonably figure out what to do with, and a vast majority who are working 2 jobs, never seeing their kids, and barely making ends meet if they don't get sick. Bill Moyers, in his introduction to Inequality Matters, which I urge you all to pick up at the end of this program, begins by looking at the news of the day, and being a very imaginative and creative person, I did exactly the same thing that Bill did this morning, and saw the news of the day, which has on the front page of the New York Times and any paper you happen to look at across the country, ExxonMobil reporting that it made a record $36 billion last year, larger than the economies of 125 countries, became the first company ever to make more than $10 billion in a single financial quarter. They're clearly not passing on their profits to average people, however. The other news of the day that caught my eye was on the Money Wire. Wages rise by smallest amount in 9 years. Wages and benefits paid to civilian workers rose last year by the smallest amount in 9 years. Now, that's putting it positively, because if you actually read the article, you find out that when inflation is considered, overall compensation actually fell 0.3%, the first time there's been a decline since '96. And when you read on further, you find out that this is actually all good news for the economy. The Federal Reserve is keeping a close watch on wage pressures. Given the strong growth in the labor market in the past 2 years, they're worried. While increases in the number of people working is good for the country, the concern at the Fed is that the economy could be growing so strongly that wage pressures will mount and trigger a rise in inflation. Well, we can't have that. CNN, just to reassure everybody, led off their story this way: real wages are having trouble keeping up with prices. First line, real wages are not exactly going through the roof. Who do you think they're writing for? The spinners love to tell us we're divided in this country, red v. blue, but I've been traveling around the country. That's not the division that counts. The division that counts is the one that we're talking about tonight, and it is a threat not just to our union, but to our state. That having been said, for the sake of posterity and for everybody watching out there in the C-SPAN audience, and we thank you, C-SPAN, for being here tonight, I want to give people a sense out there in the country that this is an issue that people in New York gathered tonight, this night of the State of the Union, to talk about, because we want to get our union in its true sense back. People talk about patriots. I believe we are the patriots here tonight, and we want our country back, and we're united in that effort. So give yourselves a round of applause, everybody that came out tonight. We are united to try to get our state back on some kind of track. We're going to hear briefly from each of our speakers, and then we'll have them talk with each other and then take questions from the audience. And I thank you again all for being here. We'll start with Paul Krugman of the New York Times. Paul.
All right. Okay. I'm going to be very nerdy for a little bit here. I want to talk about what do we know, and what do people think about this growth and inequality. And I found that it's really helpful in doing this to, well, let me just launch in with it. And I'm sorry, the thing I want to read for you is here on my laptop, so I'm actually going to do it this way. So there was a lot of people you wouldn't think are concerned about inequality. It's sometimes surprising. And so there was actually some fairly passionate discussion of the problem of inequality from this last summer from, of all people, Alan Greenspan. Somehow, I guess somehow he's finally getting out from under Ayn Rand's spell there and starting to work. And he said some things in testimony, which I think, well, let me read you some of it. And bear in mind, this is Greenspan speak, so I have to read you some to just give you the flavor. So he's saying, essentially, the 20% or the skilled management professional, what we find is the production workers' average hourly earnings are rising very modestly, but because of the distribution of the skilled worker supply and demand, what we're finding that the increase implicitly in supervisory workers' average hourly earnings is going up very much more rapidly. Representative Moore, I'm sorry, say that again. All right, for the supervisory workers, 20%, the supervisory professional, et cetera, the more skilled aspects of our labor force. So we are getting a bivariate income distribution. And as I've said many times in the past, for a democratic society, this is not helpful, to say the least. And I think that, as I have indicated on numerous occasions, I believe that this is an education problem that requires us to get the balance of skills coming out of our schools to match the skills that are and so on. So this, actually, Greenspan is saying bivariate income distribution is bad for a democracy. So he is really concerned, which is good. And he has a story. He's saying that the problem, what we're seeing is that the top 20% is doing very well, and it's basically the people with the skills. The people with the right skills are doing well, and the people without, which is the great majority, the bottom 80%, are doing badly. And that the answer is education. We've got to improve those skills. And it's a good story, good policy recommendation, and it's all completely wrong. That's the important thing. I think that the thing in understanding the problem we face is that that's not at all the story that's out there in the facts. Because it's not an 80-20 problem. It's more like a 99-1 problem. Continue being a little nerdy here. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office has these data that they put together on income distribution, and they go back to 1979 and up to 2003. So we believe that by the time that 2004 and 2005 are going to be real humdingers of increasing inequality, but it's not. We don't have the numbers yet. But anyway, just over the period they cover. Okay, it turns out that average family income goes up about a third over that period. Now, the great majority of families do get a lot less than average. The median family is a little over 10%, and the bottom fifth of the income distribution is actually going backwards. But but the average is about 33%. Now you might say, well, it's the top 20%. So we look into the top 20%. How are people doing at the 90th percentile of the income distribution? This is we're getting down to a really small minority, and the answer is 37% increase. So actually, right up there at the 90th, they're not getting an increased share. People way up there in the top, very 90th percentile, richer than 90% of Americans are still actually not. Their incomes are not going up any faster than average. On the other hand, top 1% of the income distribution, we've got an increase of 129% over the same period. And this is, if you look at it, we're not talking. The bottom of that top 1% is doing well, but not nearly that well. That's a number that's being driven by really a few tens of thousands of people with extraordinary incomes. So we really are talking about something where a tiny, tiny minority is driving this increase in inequality. It's not that the top quintile, the top 20% versus the rest. So what does that tell us? It tells us it's not about education and skills. Much as we would like to think that education is the answer, and it's the educated people who are doing well, it's just not better to be educated than not, and people with college degrees are doing better than people without, but by no means doing especially well. Roughly speaking, corporate CEOs and high school teachers have got about the same number of years of education. They're not exactly experiencing the same economic destiny lately. It's not obviously about globalization. It is true that international competition is undermining some of the traditionally well-paying, good blue-collar jobs, and we can. This is certainly a factor, but that's not explaining why people at the very top are seeing this explosion in income. And by the way, it turns out that this is not a global phenomenon, this explosion of income at the very top. It's not happening at all in the continent of Europe. It's not happening at all in Japan. It's happening in a very minor key version in Britain. But it's a uniquely American phenomenon. So it's not just that a global economy leads to huge rewards at the top. It's something that's happening in America, basically only. So what's going on? What's actually happening? Why are we seeing this explosion of wealth? And I think that the basic consensus is that we don't know. But we can say a few things about it. There is something mysterious about it. I mean, we really have to say that it's not the simple supply and demand stories don't do it. That's what Greenspan is saying. Well, we've got an increase in demand for high skill, and we're not producing enough high skilled people, and that's the story. And it's absolutely not true. That one at least doesn't work. And is there a increase in demand for rapacious CEOs and an insufficient supply of them? I don't think that's right. One of my teachers, the great MIT economist Robert Solow, once said, it was actually about a different issue, but he was saying that certain issues, economists always end up in a blaze of amateur sociology. And I think to a certain extent, that's where we end up on this. You start to ask what's happened, and a lot of talk about norms. Serious researchers talk about norms. That if, particularly, we've basically gone back to roughly, actually, More than roughly. It's almost exactly the income distribution of 1929 right now. We're sort of, Great Gatsby is back. But we had this long period after the New Deal, after World War II, of a really relatively egalitarian income distribution. And how did we do that? And the answer seems to be that there were norms established about what you could do, what you could pay people. And those norms broke down. The people who actually worry about trying to understand executive compensation literally use the phrase to describe the limit on it. It's basically, CEOs get to appoint the committee that decides how much the CEO is paid. So what limits, what actually, there's no market there. So what actually limits it? And they say, well, they talk about the outrage constraint. There was a quite strong outrage constraint in the 60s and through much of the 70s. If a CEO was paid 40 times what the average worker was paid in the company, people said, oh my God, that's terrible. These days, no, being paid 1,000 times doesn't actually raise eyebrows. Somehow the outrage constraint went away. Why did that happen? Well, at this point we start to talk about issues of political power or something. I have to say, I'm not going to go too far on this because we don't fully understand, but we do know that this is not just the workings of supply and demand. It doesn't seem to actually have much at all to do with markets. It has to do with social norms and power relationships, and something snapped in the American system, leading to this explosion of inequality. And just the last thing to say, two last things to say. What do you do about it? It's not easy to know how you restore those norms, but one thing you can certainly do about income inequality is you can tax the people with very high incomes and try to provide a stronger safety net for the people with lower incomes. And the remarkable thing, of course, about U.S. policy is that as the inequality has exploded, policy has systematically and increasingly moved to reinforce the growing gaps. The tax rates for the extremely rich have never been so low, and not since the 20s. And so there's something going on here which spreads to the political realm, and we're seeing that the political process, which you would think would be a great uprising of the other 99%, saying let's soak the rich, has actually been one of systematically favoring the people who are gaining from these trends. End of story.
Thank you. Next, let's hear from Jim Lardner.
This story goes back to the late 1970s roughly, and it kind of slipped in under the media radar. You may recall in the early 80s there were a lot of articles about the shrinking manufacturing, the shrinking middle class, those stories faded pretty soon. I recall that at the time most mainstream economists and others dismissed the idea that there was some kind of major shift towards greater inequality in America. And then we kind of forgot about it for a while. Other stories have always seemed more important these last 30 years. So this one has lurked in the background. The people who said it wasn't happening at all have been allowed the luxury of now saying it is happening without ever acknowledging that they were mistaken and that when they said it wasn't happening, and have now turned to saying that it doesn't matter. It's a non-issue, and they have several, forgive me for using this they, but there really are quite a lot of these folks who have written articles and given speeches in which they say that rising inequality does not matter. Some go further and say that it's good for us. And one of my favorites was by a guy, I have to mention his name because the story doesn't make any sense without his name. His name was, I think it's Jonah Berg. He's was, at the time he wrote this piece, an editor at the National Review, and he posited a country that consisted of only two people, himself and Bill Gates. And this was to explain why anyone who thought that inequality, the relative differences between the people at the bottom and those at the top, or the people at the middle and those at the top, was something to worry about, was an economic illiterate, or some, just didn't wasn't reasoning properly. He said in this country, which he named Gatesburgia, the inequality would be horrific, you know, and yet he went on to say, I would be tremendously well off, and he said that was because basically he would be living off of the leavings of Bill Gates. He would be able to shine his shoes, he would be able to, who knows what else, a whole variety of personal services for Bill Gates, and he would be highly paid for them, not relative to Bill Gates, but perhaps relative to what he was earning in this world, this United States, and so he would be much better off in Gatesburgia. And then he went on to add, and just imagine if Warren Buffett and the Sheikh of Brunei moved in, you know, inequality would be enormously worse, you know, and people would be writing articles about how I'm being left behind, you know. So the whole point was how silly it is to worry about that stuff. We put together this book with the idea that after nearly 3 decades of rising inequality in America, perhaps it was time to pause and take stock and look at how it has changed American life in a variety of ways. And I think we the people who, we had a conference in June of '04 nearby, and then set to work on doing this book, which is a collection of essays, but kind of a collection in which we planned it to go a certain way. We all kind of worked together, and it's a sort of connected essay consisting of essays. Not that everyone agrees about everything. I don't think that any one of us could have known or could have sensed the wide-ranging effects that we would find when we put it all together. And so an exercise that I thought of originally as being one of arming ourselves for combat, argument with those who say that inequality does not matter, also has turned out to be a very valuable exercise for those who intuitively think it does matter, but may not have really worked out just why and just in how many ways. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what in the book we consider to be results of growing economic inequality in America. One has to do with higher education, and it's interesting that education is always put forward as the solution by those who say there's a problem. And what they often ignore is that, unfortunately, the educational system is reflecting the very same pattern of increased inequality and is therefore often part of the problem, not part of the solution. And here is one illustration of how it might end up that way. The Higher Education Act of 1965 and a series of other policies that followed upon it, policies embraced by Democratic Congresses and a Democratic President, Lyndon Johnson, and a Republican President, Richard Nixon, were explicitly aimed at reducing the class divide in higher education. Grants and loans for that purpose. And this policy worked for a while. It hasn't been working lately because tuitions have soared astonishingly, and the maximum size, as some of you here in this room may be aware, the maximum grant available is now a droplet in the bucket of what it costs for a 4-year college education. And meanwhile, financial assistance both from the states and from institutions themselves is more and more being used to compete for a relatively small pool of top applicants regardless of their need. So, 40 years after the Higher Education Act, the class divide in terms of enrollment in 4-year colleges is actually widening today. It's as wide as it was 40 years ago, having gotten a little narrower, and it's getting wider, even though, of course, the economic value of a college degree has gone up tremendously. This is an example of something you see in a number of other realms of life, where a lot of Americans actually would like to see a rough threshold of equality or do not feel it's a right to have the dollar rule. Let's look at our democracy. America, of course, proselytizes with undiminished fervor all over the world for democracy. Meantime, the most important primary is no longer, any New Hampshire or Iowa or even Super Tuesday. It's what's called the wealth primary, the competition to see who can raise the most money, which candidate can raise the most money in the year before a presidential election. Wealth primary winners have gone on to win both major party nominations every time out since 1976, with one interesting exception. The one interesting exception being Howard Dean, who raised his money unconventionally in smaller amounts. The once in office, elected leaders at the federal, state, and local level raise huge campaign war chests and use redistricting powers to keep potential opponents at bay. And here I have a little quiz for you all. 401 members of the House of Representatives ran for re-election in 2004. How many do you suppose lost? 5. 5 is the number. That's 1%, so we had almost a 99% re-election rate. Imagine if that re-election rate were in some third world country, some Middle East Sheikhdom or somewhere, and they claimed to be a democracy. What would we be saying? And I just want to point out that two of those incumbents who lost as a result of a famous or notorious partisan redistricting plan in Texas. So I'm not sure those two can really be cited as examples of our vibrant democracy. So there's much else to say about the far-reaching effects of inequality, but that gives you an idea.
Thanks, Jim. Next up, from United for a Fair Economy, Major Louis.
Well, clearly, we need a lot more people outraged by inequality and the growth of it. And so sometimes it's helpful to look at our own stories. How did we get that outrage? I know the people in this room are outraged. Well, my story is a lot like what Barbara Ehrenreich talks about in this book and in her book, Nickeled and Dimed, which is that women are often one man away from poverty. So I learned about the economy when I became a single mother, and I was pounding the pavement looking for a job that fit with my son's daycare schedule and so on, and I found myself knocking at the door of a Dunkin' Donuts in Fall River, Massachusetts. The manager interviewed me and said, "Oh, you Chinese are good workers, aren't you?" So I said, "Ah, so, very good." Sorry, but I could see that he was looking at me like the coyote looks at, the road runner already roasted and on the plate. So I got the job, but about 6 months in, the cash register came up $24 short, and they docked the girls, the counter girls, 4 of us, $6 apiece. Well, that really pissed me off. I mean, it was bad enough, what the conditions that I was working under, minimum wage, etc. So I found out that there was a rule that this was illegal, especially since the supervisor had also had his hand in the till. So I tried to get the other 3 counter girls to do it with me, but they wouldn't. They were more interested in staying in good with the white manager than they were in getting their $6 back, which really surprised me because, I would think they would want their money back. But this little, and then, by the way, I did win my money back, lost my job, but got my money back. But this little Dunkin' Donuts, in a way, is a microcosm of our entire society. So if you look at, with the soap opera going on inside of it as well, but if you look at the whole situation, Dunkin' Donuts is an extremely successful company. There are Dunkin' Donuts, popping up on every street corner like mushrooms on a rotten log. And inside of it, you had the managers that were paid a reasonable amount. You had the men who were allowed to be the donut makers. The women were not, which made me wonder what special equipment do the men have to make them allowed. Then you had the women, and then you had women of color. So you have this racialized and genderized hierarchy, and that exists within our society. And unfortunately, in terms of alliances, they don't get made in logical kinds of ways. It is inequality, though, that really makes a difference. I wouldn't have been so upset if everybody was treated the same or if we were all getting the same amount. And some people might still know folks that lived through the Depression, and they say, we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor because everyone was poor. And W.E.B. Du Bois said about a century ago, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardship. And actually, when you think about Martin Luther King, we always think about his I Have a Dream speech. That was not an I Have a Dream speech. That was his show me the money speech. if you look at that speech, it was about, we're here to cash a promissory note. We were promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How can we do it? We're not going to do it. It wasn't about some fantastic dream, and that's why United for a Fair Economy has been publishing reports for 3 years now called State of the Dream to see how far we're coming. So let me give you a couple nerdy things, because I got to be like Paul. Just in terms of the current picture, in terms of income, let me just do this quickly. So just to talk about the progress, we looked at income and how much progress had been made between 1968, the year of Martin Luther King's death, and 2004. We found that the per capita income of an African American in 68 was about 55 cents on the white person's dollar. In 2004, well, actually there was a rise right after the civil rights movement, but then it receded again in the more recent years. It had risen to 57 cents. 2 cents more. So, you know, if you think we just we celebrated 50 years of Brown versus Board of Education a couple years ago, and the key words in that Supreme Court decision were all deliberate speed. So we figured that it would, at that rate of narrowing inequality, it would take 581 more years for blacks to reach income parity with whites. So that's what all deliberate speed means in this country. But if you look at wealth, it's even worse. People of color earn less, but they own far, far less. The net worth of a white family right now is about $121,000, whereas for a black family it's only $19,000. So that's like, you know, whites earn nearly twice as much as blacks, but they own nearly 11 times more than blacks. Now, why does this make any difference? I think in looking at racial economic inequality, just what you earn is not enough. Because I think Ray Bashar from the New America Foundation said that income helps you get by, but assets or wealth help you get ahead. So it's really like if you're just always trying to get income in order to survive, you're really on a treadmill. You're just running in place. But it's only if you have a little wealth can your family and community get on that escalator so that you will start to rise into the middle class and beyond. So just wanted to say, what are the myths about why some people get rich? Certainly one of the myths that goes on now is that people of color are not as wealthy because they are lazier, because they don't work as hard, and that whites are ahead because they work so hard. So back in the earlier part of the century, one of the first millionaires, a millionaire doesn't really sound like they're that rich anymore, but that was a huge thing. It was John Paul Getty, the oil magnate or whatever you call it. Was one of the first, and of course everybody wanted to know, how did you become a millionaire? And he said, it's simple. I got 3 simple things that you have to follow. The first is work hard. Everybody said, yep, I can do that. Rise early. I can do that. Third, find an oil well. That was his third thing. But you know, he never said, where did I get the land on which that oil was found? If you look at the history of the United States, the Homestead Act, which was a huge wealth-building opportunity for whites, and is still the basis of wealth for many white families in the United States today, the Homesteading Act was in 1862, right on the heels of many years of the Indian Wars in which the Indian lands were confiscated and supposedly free land was available for white families, and it was only for white families. And there's a lot of, we could go into the stories of every group that has been racialized in this country, and there are slightly different ways in which they have been disadvantaged as a verb. So they are not disadvantaged by themselves, but they were disadvantaged. So I think that as we look at economic inequality, we cannot just look at the whole picture. It's bad enough that it's growing in general, but there has always been a divide, an economic divide between whites and people of color, and that has also been growing recently. And I'll just end with just a note about our economy. If you have a family and you have several kids, and you have your teenage boy at the dinner table and you've got a bowl of mashed potatoes, and he takes all of the mashed potatoes and puts them on his own plate. What do you say to that boy? Do you say, you know, you don't say anything to him and say to the little one, what's wrong with you? How come you don't have any mashed potatoes on your plate? You know, do you say, like, try a little harder, get some mashed potatoes, but by the way, don't touch any of those potatoes on your brother's plate, you know? We really have a society right now that is just doesn't pass the any sane mother test. So it would be pretty obvious you'd say, you know, come on, Junior, share the damn mashed potatoes, right? We're not saying that in this country right now. And obviously, in a family situation, you want everyone to be healthy, you want everyone to eat, you want everyone to share the resources of the family. You know that you will be better off if your little son grows to be strong and as well. So I think just as a country, we have to consider what are the rules that we are laying down here and to get back onto the track of sanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Great job. Thank you. Well, Meju talked about it, but Paul, I'd love you to respond to one of the biggest sort of canards out there in our media. You touched on it, as I said, Meju, but there is this notion that inequality is somehow a natural consequence of the way things are, that there's a free and natural, wonderful market over here and an interfering, nasty, artificial government over there. How do you correct that record?
Okay. First thing you say is, in that case, the whole generation after World War II never happened. There must have been it must have been a myth. The fact of the matter is that the best growth the U.S. economy has ever had. You know, let's accept that GDP is your standard, of which it shouldn't be, but just do that. In fact, the best growth that the U.S. economy has ever had was during a period when the income distribution was also the most equal. The middle class was strongest. So actually, that whole period after World War II was amazing success, and it was with a relatively, by no means entirely, but relatively just society. Second thing is you look and say, well, who are the rich, and how do they get that way? And it actually turns out, you know, that yes, sure, there are, you know, there's Tiger Woods and people like that who may have something to sell as natural market forces, but an amazingly large share is people who basically have insider status. And by the way, this is all quite murky. I should say that one of the problems we have is that there are small numbers of, because so much of the wealth is concentrated in small groups of people, many of the statistics, the way that they're captured, don't get it, don't actually pick this up. That's census data, for example. You'll see somebody says, you know, look at, well, the U.S. Census says such and such. It's U.S. Census data systematically, for well-known reasons, misses very high incomes, which means it misses all of the real action here. But we look at, and a lot of it is executive compensation, CEOs and top five, and that's not a market. That's an insider thing. It's really nothing at all about market forces, and we know that there's essentially no relationship between executive pay and executive performance, right? So there is nothing in there about the market, about rewards.
I thought it was the more people you lay off, the better your salary gets.
Well, that's right. No, it's actually a willingness to inflict pain. This is definitely a good. But no, so yeah. So the point is, it's just if you have a little sense. Well, I have to say I confront this. People saying, well, isn't it always true that as you make progress that the gap between rich and poor grows? The answer is no. Actually, in fact, when I was going to graduate school 30-something years ago, we were told that as countries advance, they become more middle class and the great disparities went away. And this is something new. This is not the way it has to be. This is something that, yeah. But I worry that people have, one of the things that I find most frustrating about the situation, I'm talking too long here, but is the ease with which this very weird, and I'd say un-American thing that's happening is becoming accepted as a natural order of things. This is the way it has to be, and it doesn't.
To you, Jim, we're marking today the death of Coretta Scott King, and in many of the obituaries, it will be reminded that in April of '68, she led a march in Memphis right after Dr. King's assassination. What we might not be reminded of is that later that very same year, she led the Poor People's March in Washington, D.C. It seems like a long time since we had poor people's marches like that. Jim, in your piece in the book Inequality Matters, you investigate the question of, are people indifferent to this gap, or are they simply resigned? Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and how do you know?
Pollsters and political scientists, quite a lot of them, will tell you that Americans by nature do not care about economic differences, that we set up the most successful, the people with the most money as role models rather than questioning how they got that much. However, if you look at a lot of the things that we clearly do care about, the things that we have active policy debates over and come up with policy solutions for, whether the solutions work or not, they turn out to be problems that have been greatly aggravated by growing economic inequality. Only after we produced this book did I realize one of them, which is the alleged Social Security crisis, the shortfall in the Social Security, funds over the next 50 years is largely the result of the fact that so much income growth has gone to a tiny few in America lately that the percentage of total income that is captured by the Social Security tax, which ends above, what is it now, $90,000? Mm-hmm. Has been declining. Once the Social Security tax captured 90% of all income, now I think it's 85%, and that difference alone accounts for, I believe, more than half of this shortfall over the next 50 years. But there are so many other examples. The uninsured being a pretty graphic one. We can call it a problem of lack of health insurance, or we can call it one aspect of a problem of a healthcare system that is devoting immense resources to the needs of a relatively well-heeled few and is confronting everyone else with skyrocketing costs which they are increasingly expected to pay out of their own pockets. It's not impossible to imagine national health insurance in America coming in a form that still wouldn't solve this problem because so many health insurance plans that so many people have that they can get leave them with so many costs uncovered. So I think it is important to see the bigger picture.
But do people care? Are they indifferent to this, or are they resigned to it?
They care about the consequences. It's the word and the abstraction that people don't care about.
Paul, did you want to come in? Say, on health insurance, this actually wasn't what I was going to say, but this is other. 62% of the public says that the government should guarantee health insurance for everyone. It's one of these things. It's politically impossible to have universal health insurance, and yet it's politically. If you ask people, it's got overwhelming public support. So it's tells you something about the nature of political possibility in our society. But I want to say, I think actually people are, I'm not sure how concerned people are about inequality, but I think they would be more concerned if they actually knew how big it was. And I think part of the problem, this is one of these things where there's a kind of almost self-reinforcing aspect, is that when the gaps grow really big, people lose sight. Sort of both ends disappear into the fog. If I can just take a second, two stories. One is I had a piece in the New York Times Magazine 3 years ago about inequality, and it started, the opening story was about the return of gigantic mansions for the wealthy. And when you do one of those pieces, you don't see the artwork, you don't see the photos until I saw them the same time everybody else did, and I was never asked. And so at the front they had what the New York Times art department thought was a picture of an outrageous mansion. And it wasn't. It was a picture of actually 2 blocks from me. There's Princeton's a nice place, and I live in a pretty high-end town, and that was a $3 million, 6,000 square foot house they had. That is not what today's wealthy are building. Today's wealthy are building $60 million, 30,000 square foot houses. But the art department.
Homes. Second and third homes.
Yes, right. And the art. So they even at the New York Times has no idea how rich the rich are. And at the other end, and this is something. I mean, I'm doing work on healthcare quite a lot now, and most of which you know never makes it into the Times. But anyway, Medicaid is essentially a program of medical care for the poor and near poor, and I, in my mind, thought of it as this is a relatively small group of people that is there. It's a safety net. It's a relatively small group of people. Medicaid is essentially the same size as Medicare. It's 38 million versus 40 million people. A huge chunk of despite the fact that there are many people who should be on Medicaid who are not getting it, the fact is there's a huge, and now I don't know anybody on Medicaid. I don't know anybody who's ever been on Medicaid for, sitting in the upper middle class but I think that many middle class Americans you have no idea. I, with paying a lot of attention to this, had no idea just how many people are. Essentially, you have to be fairly desperate to be pushed onto Medicaid, and I didn't. With all the time I've spent worrying about these issues, I had no idea just how many people are in that situation.
And the budget that is likely to be voted on tomorrow or sometime this week is going to cut Medicaid for almost all the children on it, and it goes on. But let me mention you. I mean, surely the question of does inequality matter was writ large in the Gulf when we saw in New Orleans it mattered whether you survived or whether you drowned.
No, absolutely. And actually, we just put out a report called Stalling the Dream, which was about car ownership. And it turns out that in our country, which, everything supposedly what was good for General Motors was good for the country, so our whole society is built around roadways. Instead of public transportation, we spent public dollars on building highways that you can't use unless you own a car. And it turns out that 7% of white families don't own cars, but 24% of African American, 17% of Latino families don't own cars. So we have a wealth gap in terms of car ownership, and in New Orleans that made a critical difference. And we looked at evacuation plans all around the city, all around the country, and they all depend on your access to a private car. But I wanted to say one thing too about the healthcare issue. What do we think is the largest contributor to the good health of the nation? Sanitation systems, clean water. Right now, we spend like 1% of all the money we spend on health-related stuff on public health. And, we're talking about terror attacks and biological weapons. We're not prepared. 1%, 99% is spent on treatment or finding out cures and drugs for some of them quite esoteric diseases, and newer and newer technology. So again, this is where we're not paying attention to the commons, the things that really help people the most. Dental care, fluorination of the water was one of the things that really eliminated dental problems for so many kids and people in our country. So again, we need to invest a lot more, and I think that's part of the solution that we're pointing to in this book. We need to invest a lot more in the common good in our commons.
And Paul, it looked like you wanted to come in on this. I just wanted to urge you to talk a little bit about the programs that do work. You wrote about one recently, the Veterans Health Administration.
Okay, let me just, the thing I couldn't resist coming in on was that there was actually a major research effort from the congressional leadership that was launched immediately after Katrina, actually even before the National Guard actually arrived finally, which was they began desperately searching for anyone who had died in Katrina who was wealthy enough to owe a state tax. And they never did find one.
In order to let them not pay.
In order to use that person as a poster child, poster adult for the importance of repealing the estate tax.
They were going to.
No, I mean healthcare. Look, I said that it's very hard to do stuff. We don't know. We have a rough notion of how it was that middle class America was created by Franklin Roosevelt. And we don't know how to replicate those conditions. It was a combination of a very powerful union movement, which was brought into existence partly by the New Deal, wartime conditions, and there was a lot of sort of leveling that took place under the war, which stuck for 40 years. Don't know how to do that. Again, things we do know how to do. Healthcare is it. I mean, there's an enormous. It's not exactly, it's related to inequality, but the riskiness of life for Americans is much greater than that for other advanced countries. And a large part of that is because you're just one illness away from intense poverty. And that's because we do not have a safety net on health care. And this is one of those things where, aside from just the question of helping people out, this is a case of ideology just totally trumps all the evidence. Right now, the drug thing, now, every time that there's been any head-to-head competition between the government providing the insurance or introducing private companies as middlemen, simple government provision wins hands down. There's enormous saving in paperwork costs. Medicare has been trying to push these healthcare Medicare Advantage plans. They're now heavily subsidized because they cannot compete head-to-head with just straight Medicare. So what they did with the Medicare drug bill was they simply you were not allowed to simply get your insurance from Medicare. So they created a completely gratuitous level of private companies. And it turns out that simple, Canadian style if you like, but there are other countries that you can borrow from as well. Simple national health care is remarkably cheaper than the system that this fragmented system we have. So much so that if we actually went to national health care, which covered all the uninsured, it would almost certainly be cheaper in total than our current system. That is, the cost of covering all of the uninsured is negative. And then it turns out that worse yet, which people I guess I've mentioned in the Times that I wrote about this in the Times. We actually have one island of socialized medicine in the United States, which is the Veterans Administration healthcare system, and it is wildly efficient. It's not just very cost effective, but it turns out that it actually, by all the measures of healthcare quality, it's the best system in America. And it has low costs, low administrative costs, low rates of medical errors, but I mentioned, I can't tell you who, but a very well-known pundit and I were in a green room, and we were just sort of chatting, and I mentioned, if you looked at the VA system, it's really good. And he actually started screaming at me in outrage. No, you're wrong. And I said, have you looked at the facts? No, you're wrong. It's a lousy system. It's a government program. It's got to be terrible. And that's where we are in this country.
Did his name begin with a B and then an O?
What's sorry?
His name didn't begin with a B and then an O?
No.
No, okay. I want to just address two more points. One is what's stopping change, and the second is what happens if we don't change course. What's stopping change, the question comes to me because if you raise the question of raising the minimum wage, one of the tools we might have to decrease inequality. All across this country, there are majorities polling in favor of an increase in the minimum wage. You saw in Nevada and Florida ballot initiatives that raised the minimum wage by $1 passed in every county of those two states. Rich, poor, urban, rural, conservative, liberal, passed everywhere. Against, in Florida in particular, the business lobby, all out against it. In Utah, I was just in Utah, the last state to give George Bush really healthy approval ratings. When it's polled on the question of minimum wage increase, 67% of those polled wanted an increase and to spend their budget surplus on that increase rather than any more in the way of tax cuts. Who is stopping change? Why is it so difficult to make change on something as simple as that? Jim, you want to start?
I'll try. First of all, it does have something to do with the fact that all the institutions that we would normally look to give us a clear view of what is going on have themselves been colored by this growing economic inequality. So Paul said earlier that maybe if the story was more fully told, if people knew how bad it was, there would be more anger. I think that's true. I think that if the connection were made between growing economic inequality and diminished opportunity, that would make a big difference.
But they wanted, the people wanted, it's the legislators who keep wanting to talk about tax cuts.
People who support tax cuts, according to some polling, never make any connection between that and some change in the overall distribution of wealth, power, and income in America. They have no idea that these tax cuts might feed that. They don't think of it in those terms. The paper on this whole subject by Mr. Krugman's colleague,
Larry Bartels,
had the title Homer gets a tax cut, and you show someone looking very like Homer Simpson holding a check for, 50 cents and smiling delightedly. But I think
with Mr. Burns next to him with bags and bags of money. Going, that was wonderful.
And but I just want to say, I think that the free market ethos and the belief that there is such a thing as a free market has us in its grip more than any other people, and perhaps more than us at this time, more than any other time, and that it is to some extent a relic of the Cold War, when it made a certain sense as a view of the world to see our Western market economies as a free market and, the Soviet system as unfree. But the fact is that markets, to be functioning, to be successful, they cannot be free. They must have rules and social norms and institutions and enforcement mechanisms. And these rules, this whole system has changed dramatically in recent decades. And it isn't entirely a matter of policy changes, although there are plenty of those to look at, and there are essays in the book that talk about that. It's also, as Paul Krugman says, it's a matter of social norms. And you see cases in which, for example, the Taft-Hartley law made it possible to replace strikers with permanent replacement workers, but it took corporate America and America as a whole 20 or 30 years to actually exercise that right that Taft-Hartley gave them. So if this free market idea, which is so powerful in America, is one that is a paralyzing idea. It makes you think there is no reason to think about the level of economic inequality because there is nothing we can do about it. And when you don't think about something, it's human nature not to look too closely at it, not to look at the consequences. So it becomes a whole vicious circle which is fed by the media and other institutions that,
Measure view.
Yeah, what's stopping change? I think the Democrats, for one thing. And there's actually an article in this book that talks about how in countries where there are more political parties, you're likely to have more equality because working people, lower income people, are more likely to have a voice in a coalitional type of government. So we live in a country that can't count past 2. I never could quite figure out why 2 was more democratic than, say, 3 or maybe 4. But it's just, either with us or with the enemy. The other thing is there is really a conscious mystification of the economy and what's going on, so that people are made stupid. I was talking with Amy Rowe, we were talking about how people are kind of made stupid. So, for example, we're constantly told, we have a jobless recovery. Like, this is great. But it's an oxymoron. For if you don't have a job, how is it a recovery? But if you're told this over and over again, you're thinking like by experts, right? You're thinking like, I must be stupid because I really don't get this. I know I don't have a job, but so I think a lot of our job is to take apart these myths and to really let people see what's going on. One of the things we do at United for a Fair Economy is that we noticed that a lot of people were really outraged by service cuts, but they were still voting for tax cuts. So by helping them to make that connection is a way that we can really get people to understand the policies that drive their own economic inequality.
I'm just surprised that neither of my co-panelists is just talking about the raw influence of money in politics. Just that. I mean, I haven't looked at the minimum wage politics, but I did a little bit, and was paying a lot of attention to Elizabeth Warren's work on the bankruptcy bill, which is a monstrosity, but was passed with, I'm sorry to say, wide bipartisan support. And you look behind that, and it's money. It's the power of a lobby. It's a certain talkative Democratic senator suddenly stopped being the senator from Delaware and became the senator for MBNA, and it's
MBNA is what?
And Paul Wellstone died.
What?
Paul Wellstone single-handedly stopped it in one session, and
That's
then
right.
he died.
Yeah.
There was no one with his courage.
And it was truly, and this was certainly not that the Senate was unaware. Everything, the intellectual arguments had been made, had been laid out. There was the credit card companies barely even tried to make a rational economic case for the bill. They just sort of spread the money And it was one of the more depressing things to watch. It could make you a complete cynic about the system.
So the last question is, you mentioned that we have, as a country, not been this unequal, since 1929. That's always a date that sticks in the mind. What happens if we don't change direction? Paul, then Jim, then Maishu.
It would be nice, it would be sort of a good morality play if, in fact, the 29 thing was, if that meant that disaster strikes just over the horizon. I'm not sure. I mean, it's not clear that the Great Depression was a necessary, follow-on the inequalities of American society. It's not. It would be nice if that were true, but economics is not a morality play. And it doesn't. So it's possible you can struggle along like this for a very long time. What does happen is it does start to impair. It's of course there are a lot of things. First of all, just a lot of people are miserable. It becomes a worse and a meaner society, and I think in the end by having people increasingly just left out of the system, it actually ends up in the end maybe even making some of the rich worse off. I guess the thing that worries me most, aside from just the sort of ongoing human misery, but put all that on one side, there is a real question about democracy. When you have, I don't have my Theodore Roosevelt quotes exactly to at my fingertips, but something about if there are men who are rich enough to own the government, they will. This is the problem. It is as we start to look in income distribution. Like a third world country, maybe we start to have the politics of a third world country, and that's I think the gravest danger.
Jim, final thought from you.
I take comfort from the fact that, as deformed as our democracy is, that many of the policies that have fed this growing inequality were not laid out there in the open. On the contrary, there was a tremendous investment over several decades in the creation of think tanks and journals and the hiring of wordsmiths and all kinds of young whiz kids to come up with a whole vocabulary of justifying these policies that made them seem to be for all our good. The examples, the estate taxes, the death is an estate tax that in truth affects a tiny, tiny number of the richest estates, is characterized as a death tax that threatens family farms and small businesses. And as far as I know, they're never able to come up with a family farm or a small business. And the tax relief for all Americans is the euphemism for the tax cuts for the few, so forth and so on. All of this subterfuge, all of the massive investment of propaganda, what accounts for it? Why was it deemed necessary? It can only be that somebody somewhere thought that if Americans really understood what was going on, they wouldn't go for it. And that if they raised a cry of protest, that things would change. And I think there's a lot of reason to think that things would change, because they've changed in societies with far less democracy than we have.
If Americans weren't divided one from the other. Maishu.
Just quickly, I mean, I think that I'm with Paul in terms of democracy, and Jim, that democracy is like a muscle. If you don't exercise it, it will atrophy. And just as we've become an obese nation in terms of our physical, we're also obese in terms of our democracy. And I think that people don't realize that it isn't. You can't take it for granted. You can lose it. And in the United States, we're very complacent because, again, we're told over and over again, this is the most democratic country in the world, blah, blah, blah. And people believe it, but they will lose it if they don't actually exercise democracy by learning about what's going on, by exercising their critical thinking and making policies that are for the benefit of the nation as a whole, because united we stand and divided we will fall.
Thank you. We have a little time before the end of the program, which is when you all dash to the back and buy the books. Oh, no, to the front and buy the books, and we'll sign them. So if you want to raise a question, come up to this microphone, and I want to see women and men. And anybody else. Sir.
Yes. I want to thank you all for your positions on where we're at right now. But I have one thing I haven't heard in 45 minutes here, the effect of what the war has done on this economy.
Good question.
The war is milking us dry on every aspect. I'd like to hear your comments on that and how can we get out of it? Because it's been wrong from day one. It continues, and nothing's happening. Nothing's happening really. And number two, Paul, dealing with the issue of the VA hospitals. You are absolutely correct. But this administration wants to cut back on the VA hospitals. They have been holding the CARES lap hearings, which in turn, they want to either merge Brooklyn and Manhattan on 23rd Street or even close them down.
All right, thanks. Let's take three questions. So one, the impact of the war, and what about the hospitals to you?
I have a question to Dr.
That mic?
Okay.
That's it.
I have a question to Dr. Krugman. Can insane salaries of CEOs be simply explained by the lack of diffusion tools? I mean, if exploitation is less, such as if people don't work 80 hours instead of 40 and are paid only for, if there are mandatory vacation, which don't allow, all these tools which don't allow accumulation in one corner office and just spread around, which is done in other countries, European countries. Can you just explain?
Are there other tools to address the inequality, executive compensation and worker compensation? Is that the question?
Yes.
All right, good. Last one, and then we'll take answers.
I'd like to speak to the fact that our trade, international trade, is in a pretty bad situation. And I wonder how much the fact that companies have to include health care in the cost of their products leads to our being less competitive in the international market.
Great question. All right, we've got three questions. Let's get some answers. Who wants to address the question of the war? What difference does a war make? Jim.
I'm going to take one tack on that, which is that Paul spoke about the danger of our democracy becoming, or our country becoming more like a third world society, our politics. And one of the ways in which we may experience that process is the pattern of going to war when times are tough domestically.
Yeah. Let me just. I was against the war from the beginning, and I think it's a nightmare for even quite from every side of everything else. It's just been a terrible blow to U.S. national security. I think you don't want to make it the root of all evil. And the fact is that this trend of growing inequality long predates the Iraq War. The Iraq War is big by any normal human standards, but the U.S. economy is immense, and the war is about 1/3% of gross domestic. No, it's 2/3% of gross domestic product now is going into the war. That's sort of 1/3 of Vietnam. It's not a huge story here. It's a horrible thing. But it's not this story. So I think just this is. I don't know. May never be able to know how much it was conscious. It was certainly true that if you were to ask. In the summer of 2002, it appeared that we might be getting some genuine populist outrage over corporate scandals, over the whole inequality, and then all of a sudden, the drumbeat of war completely silenced that. I don't know if that's how much you want to say that was deliberate and how much it's just how it happened, but it certainly has warped our politics these past 3 years.
Meiju, did you want to answer that question, or maybe the one about executive compensation?
Just to say that in terms of the war, it's the only time in United States history where there has not been shared sacrifice, in that the cost of the war is borne by low-income people, as is the fighting of the war, and the wealthy companies have benefited. So it's another example of how the divide has grown.
Yeah, just about the executive compensation. In France or in Germany, which are by no, they have their own problems. They don't have our problems. They have different problems. But in France or Germany, you have powerful unions. Yeah. You have parties of the left that actually stand up, all of which means that their outrage constraint binds a lot more tightly than it binds the way it used to in the United States. And so they are continuing to pay top executives roughly the way the American top executives were paid in the 1960s, 40 times typical worker's salary. And they're by no means impoverished, but what's happened in the United States is that we have somehow lost all of the countervailing power, all of the countervailing voices, the people who can say, my God, why is this guy who has actually been running the company into the ground being paid $30 million a year?
Somehow lost, as in trade unions smashed into the ground?
Certainly, the collapse of the private sector unions in the United States is a big part of this story.
They were pushed.
Yes.
On the question of healthcare and the ability to compete, it was interesting. The Ford company chose to shut down 14 plants and announced the layoffs of 30,000 over a few years. I only found out on my radio program, which airs weekends on Air America Radio 1190, that a lot of the work was being transferred not to developing nations, but to Canada, where a worker is $10 cheaper an hour because of the healthcare burden.
It's one of the enduring mysteries. If you go, the big three automakers are also the big three automakers in Canada. In Canada, they are ferocious defenders of Canadian Medicare, the national health system. They write letters to the government saying, you mustn't tamper with this. This is a crucial aspect of Canadian industrial competitiveness. And in the United States, why aren't they advocating such a system here? And we wonder, and you keep on, and you read some of the speeches particularly by Wagner, the CEO of General Motors, and you keep on saying, and the last line of this column is going to be a call for a single-payer healthcare system, and he never says it. And our question is he just be afraid of being blackballed at the country club? What's going on here?
Called a socialist.
Yeah. Okay, three more questions, and then that's probably going to be it. We can't have all three men, so let's have one. Oh, there you are.
There we go.
1, 2, 3. We'll make it 4. We'll have you as well. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Go.
Okay. First, just comments. Yeah, I think we live in a corporate oligarchy and sound bites, and just a very short story, and then a question, which is I go down to a small mountain town every year for a music festival, and I'm a rather intelligent guy. We go into a breakfast place, and what they see of the news is a little bit on TV, and that's about it. Now, people like you, Paul, and Maureen, I always read your columns. You're saying the truth, but so there are two questions. One is, how can the truth reach the vast majority of quotation marks middle America, and why the hell isn't the press, and it's not people like you, but like getting out there and giving the message? Are they part of the problem? Okay.
All right.
I mean, they are part of
Okay, good. 2.
Professor Krugman, if the outrage constraint's no longer working, do you support, in theory, regulation to try to disincentivize excessive compensation for executives?
Okay. Good question. And then 2 over there. Yes.
Okay. My friend and I were musing the other day about how we will talk about the most intimate secrets of our social lives, of our family lives, of our sex lives, but nobody talks about money. And that there's this thing about money, and especially among like upper middle class, white, sort of guilt-laden, that sort of atmosphere of people. And I know that this is directed at Mrs. Liu. United for a Fair Economy was doing some work directed at wealthier Americans who wanted to change, and I'd love for you to hear about that work and how it's going.
One more? All right, 2 more and 1 here. Be brief. You're all being great. You're all being great. Go for it.
We've spoken a lot this evening about social norms and what effect the social norms have on the mentality that most Americans have about the inequality that pervades this society. But Dr. Cornel West wrote 2 books, one Culture Matters and the other Race Matters, and specifically addressing this issue. When are we as Americans gonna just wake up and say, you know what, I'm a part of the disenfranchised and I'm a part of the problem and I need to do something about it? What's your thoughts on that?
Thanks. Here.
This is for Professor Krugman. I'm more concerned about the increase in wealth inequalities than in income inequalities, and that does seem to be very much fostered by public policy. We've always had much more disparate income inequalities than other advanced Western countries. I mean, a measure like the Gini coefficient, we're disastrously behind almost all other advanced societies, but we were pretty far behind them in 1980, and it hasn't really changed that much. I'm not sure, what on the top end isn't being captured. I think it is somewhat more an 80-20 than a 99-1 problem, because if the median change is 10%, 1 standard deviation removed from the median is 37%, and 2 standard deviations removed is 129%.
You're losing it.
Sorry.
All right. I think we get the thrust of it. Thank you. There. That's it for questions. Go.
Every time someone seems to propose something in Congress or elsewhere that would address even one aspect of this inequality issue, this administration shouts it down as class warfare. So I want to know what we can do to make class warfare a good thing.
I knew you were the right person to end the program. All right, we've got a bunch of questions there. How can the truth break through our kind of soundbite culture? How can we disincentivize inequality? What are we doing to talk about class? We'll talk about sex before we'll talk about money. What about all the divisions? Can we come together to see ourselves as one boat going down rather than it's always some poor person, some darker skinned person, some female person, or increasingly somebody from another country that's their problem? Wealth inequality versus income inequality, and how can we spin positive on class warfare? Who wants to pick 1 or 2 in response? Start with you, Jim.
All right. We start with the question about a regulation, a limit on CEO pay or something like that. I don't really want to try to address, and I don't even know my own convictions about the merits of such a regulation, but I just want to say that in the real world, I don't think you're going to get regulation when the outrage quotient isn't very high. In the real world, I think regulation of something like that is going to come when the outrage quotient is high. So raising consciousness is a necessary element of all this, raising the outrage quotient. And there are possibilities, there are glimpses of potential in this audience right here, in this book, in this program being on C-SPAN, in the fact that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, all within the last year have run large, ambitious, really well-done series on declining mobility, the increased kind of stress and volatility and insecurity that affects the middle class. I like to think that instead of being a country divided between those who think that inequality does not matter and those who think it does, that we are all on a journey, and we're at various stages of the realization of how much it does matter.
Monsieur Louis.
Just a couple quick things in terms of some ways of exposing what's going on. In 2000, we had a sort of a project that was called Billionaires for Bush or Gore. And there's a great chapter here in New York that always has demonstrations on tax day in front of the post office and so on and so forth. But, whoever Bush was campaigning, there would be a crowd of people that was dressed like rich people with their signs, because inequality is not growing fast enough. And, it would take the Bush people a while to figure out that these were hecklers. So you get behind the enemy lines that way, so that was really fun. So I think like finding those kinds of things, and of course the media would zero in on that. Remember during the Republican convention, it was the billionaires for Bush playing croquet in Central Park that got all the media attention because you know, there was no demonstrations, but people playing croquet in Central Park, you know, that was cool. In terms of just the Responsible Wealth Project, too, I think we've always found and do feel that there is room for everyone. It's not about just poor people. If it was just poor people talking about inequality, nobody would care, nobody would pay attention, and we do need allies. It's got to be a big movement, just as in the Civil Rights Movement, you had many white people, you had wealthy people that were funding it, and so on. But I think the important thing is that people with wealth don't just have money, and sometimes we stereotype them as that's what they have to contribute. No, they have their voices to give too. So for instance, Bill Gates Sr., he didn't give us a lot of money, but what he did in opening up that conversation about the estate tax was far more valuable, and I think that the estate tax probably would be repealed now if he had not spoken out against it and opened up all people's consciousness. In terms of the question of like coming together, I think this country still has not faced the question of the racial divide head on. And it's like today, people don't want to talk about it. It's like a thing of the past. And I think that we need to continue, especially white people, to talk with other white people too about the importance of recognizing the advantages that white people have had. And it's not to make you feel guilty, it's just to say these are the policies that were put in place over a number of centuries that benefited you. What are the policies we can put in place today to close that gap?
Yeah, I can't deal with it. About Gini coefficients. No. Basically, the answer is no. It's not true that the U.S. has always been more unequal than others, but not to this extent. And it's a drastic change over the past 25 years. And it's about a very, very top end. And these are not small numbers. People used to say, well, you know, what does it matter if it's a little bit more? We are actually talking about huge redistribution to people at the very, very top of the income distribution. This is not a small thing. Whoever the person was, Reed, Piketty, and Sias. It's really, this is not something that's a marginal concern. It's the core of the story. I think I can take two things together, press and what you can do. Why is the press, and we are getting better stories on it, but certainly on a lot of issues you wonder, where is the press, why isn't it covering? And from where I would sit, I would say a large part of it is sheer intimidation. You have no idea what it's like if you cross the dominant political movement these days. It's not just, you know, of course, enormous quantities of mail that needs to be picked up with tongs, but it's organized attempts to undermine you, to find things to discredit. You know, you become a target, and most people in the media become very afraid of that, and they internalize it. They steer clear of it. It's a sad thing, but it's true. And of course, my secret is I have another job. And what you can do about it is actually counter pressure, countervailing forces. Because I've seen a number of instances now in which mobilized people on the moderate left sort of go after inaccurate press reporting on stories, and the press people are hysterical because they thought they had found the way to play it safe. And then they're discovering, oh, it's not safe to sort of accept untruths from one side, so that they won't scream at us, because there's now starting to be an organized constituency that will scream at us. But it has its effect. You can watch the subsequent reporting, and it gets better. And it's not just the press. You should also scream at your congressman. You scream at your, you know. But this is certainly it matters a lot this is going back to Jim talking about the organization of the bad ideas. There was a whole machine set in place to influence press coverage, to influence the intellectual climate, to influence the buzzwords that was set up beginning in the 1970s. And, I myself, I did not understand until a couple of years ago, just how all of this. But now we're very much behind the curve. But this is how you do it. This is how you change the debate and part of it involves screaming at the messengers who are not conveying the truth.
So if we promise to flood your bosses with applause, will you write a column, Class War Good?
I think I will have done that, yes. But no, but positive, never mind the positive. When some journalist, especially not the opinion journalists, but when there's a story that is allegedly just a reporting story that has got it wrong, send the negative mail, send the negative emails and phone calls. You'd be amazed how freaked people get because they've acclimated to the view that you only get that kind of pressure from the right, and they're startled and initially outraged, but eventually affected when comes from the other side.
I want to thank everybody and everybody here. You've got your marching orders. The people at Demos, United for a Fair Economy, and the New Press, thank you for coming. Stay tuned for more information, and there are books at the front that can be signed.
We would like to think that education is the answer, and it's the educated people who are doing well. It's just not better to be educated than not, and people with college degrees are doing better than people without, but by no means doing especially well. Roughly speaking, corporate CEOs and high school teachers have got about the same number of years of education. They're not exactly experiencing the same economic destiny lately. It's not obviously about globalization. It is true that international competition is undermining some of the traditionally well-paying, good blue-collar jobs, and this is certainly a factor. But that's not explaining why people at the very top are seeing this explosion in income. And by the way, it turns out that this is not a global phenomenon. This explosion of income at the very top. It's not happening at all in the continent of Europe. It's not happening at all in Japan. It's happening in a very minor key version in Britain, but it's a uniquely American phenomenon. So it's not just that a global economy leads to huge rewards at the top. It's something that's happening in America, basically only. So what's going on? What's actually happening? Why are we seeing this explosion of wealth? And I think that the basic consensus is that we don't know. But we can say a few things about it. There is something mysterious about it. I mean, really have to say that it's not the simple supply and demand stories don't do it. That's what Greenspan is saying. Well, we've got an increase in demand for high skill, and we're not producing enough high skilled people, and that's the story. And it's absolutely not true. That one at least doesn't work. And is there a increase in demand for rapacious CEOs and an insufficient supply of them? I don't think that's right. One of my teachers, the great MIT economist Robert Solow, once said, it was actually about a different issue, but he was saying that certain issues, economists always end up in a blaze of amateur sociology. And I think to a certain extent, that's where we end up on this. You start to ask what's happened, and a lot of talk about norms. Serious researchers talk about norms. That if, particularly, we've basically gone back to roughly, actually more than roughly, it's almost exactly the income distribution of 1929 right now. Where sort of Great Gatsby is back, but we had this long period after the New Deal, after World War II, of a really relatively egalitarian income distribution. And how did we do that? And the answer seems to be that there were norms established about what you could do, what you could pay people. And those norms broke down.
But I've been traveling around the country. That's not the division that counts. The division that counts is the one that we're talking about tonight. And it is a threat not just to our union, but to our state. That having been said, for the sake of posterity and for everybody watching out there in the C-SPAN audience, and we thank you, C-SPAN, for being here tonight, I want to give people a sense out there in the country that this is an issue that people in New York gathered tonight, this night of the State of the Union, to talk about, because we want to get our union, in its true sense, back. People talk about patriots. I believe we are the patriots here tonight, and we want our country back, and we're united in that effort. So give yourselves a round of applause, everybody that came out tonight. We are united to try to get our state back on some kind of track. We're going to hear briefly from each of our speakers, and then we'll have them talk with each other and then take questions from the audience. And I thank you again all for being here. We'll start with Paul Krugman of the New York Times. Paul.
Okay. I'm going to be very nerdy for a little bit here. I want to talk about what do we know, and what do people think about this growth and inequality. And I found that it's really helpful in doing this to. Well, let me just launch in with it. And I'm sorry, the thing I want to read for you is here on my laptop, so I'm actually going to do it this way. So there was a lot of people you wouldn't think are concerned about inequality. It's sometimes surprising, and so there was actually some fairly passionate discussion of the problem of inequality from this last summer from, of all people, Alan Greenspan. Somehow, I guess somehow he's finally getting out from under Ayn Rand's spell there and starting to work. And he said some things in testimony, which I think, well, let me read you some of it. And bear in mind, this is Greenspan speak, so I have to read you some to just give you the flavor. So he's saying, essentially, the 20% or the skilled management professional, what we find is the production workers' average hourly earnings are rising very modestly, but because of the distribution of the skilled worker supply and demand, what we're finding that the increase implicitly in supervisory workers' average hourly earnings is going up very much more rapidly. Representative Moore, I'm sorry, say that again. All right, for the supervisory workers, 20%, the supervisory professional, et cetera, the more skilled aspects of our labor force. So we are getting a bivariate income distribution. And as I've said many times in the past, for a democratic society, this is not helpful, to say the least. And I think that, as I have indicated on numerous occasions, I believe that this is an education problem that requires us to get the balance of skills coming out of our schools to match the skills that are and so on. So this actually, Greenspan is saying bivariate income distribution is bad for a democracy. So he is really concerned, which is good. And he has a story. He's saying that the problem, what we're seeing is that the top 20% is doing very well, and it's basically the people with the skills. The people with the right skills are doing well, and the people without, which is the great majority, the bottom 80%, are doing badly. And that the answer is education. We've got to improve those skills. And it's a good story, good policy recommendation, and it's all completely wrong. That's the important thing. I think that the thing in understanding the problem we face is that that's not at all the story that's out there in the facts. Because it's not an 80-20 problem. It's more like a 99-1 problem. Continue being a little nerdy here. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office has these data that they put together on income distribution, and they go back to 1979 and up to 2003. So we believe that by the time that 2004 and 2005 are going to be real humdingers of increasing inequality, but it's not. We don't have the numbers yet. But anyway, just over the period they cover. Okay, it turns out that average family income goes up about a third over that period. Now, the great majority of families do get a lot less than average. The median family is a little over 10%, and the bottom fifth of the income distribution is actually going backwards. But but the average is about 33%. Now, you might say, well, it's the top 20%. So we look into the top 20%. How are people doing at the 90th percentile of the income distribution? This is we're getting down to a really small minority, and the answer is 37% increase. So actually, right up there at the 90th, they're not getting an increased share. People way up there, the top, very 90th percentile, richer than 90% of Americans are still actually not. Their incomes are not going up any faster than average. On the other hand, top 1% of the income distribution, we've got an increase of 129% over the same period. And this is, if you look at it, we're not talking. The bottom of that top 1% is doing well, but not nearly that well. That's a number that's being driven by really a few tens of thousands of people with extraordinary incomes. So we really are talking about something where a tiny, tiny minority is driving this increase in inequality. It's not that the top quintile, the top 20% versus the rest. So what does that tell us? It tells us it's not about education and skills. Much as we
won't hear at any other point this evening. And so let me introduce Laura Flanders. Laura?
All right, thank you everybody. I'm very glad to see you and not that other guy in front of me tonight. I'm Laura Flanders, and I don't know what our president is going to hallucinate this evening, but we in the reality-based community know that the state of our union really is not. We don't have a union. We have at this point a tiny minority who are earning more wealth than they can reasonably figure out what to do with, and a vast majority who are working 2 jobs, never seeing their kids, and barely making ends meet if they don't get sick. Bill Moyers, in his introduction to Inequality Matters, which I urge you all to pick up at the end of this program, begins by looking at the news of the day, and being a very imaginative and creative person, I did exactly the same thing that Bill did this morning, and saw the news of the day, which has on the front page of the New York Times and any paper you happen to look at across the country, ExxonMobil reporting that it made a record $36 billion last year, larger than the economies of 125 countries, became the first company ever to make more than $10 billion in a single financial quarter. They're clearly not passing on their profits to average people, however. The other news of the day that caught my eye was on the Money Wire. Wages rise by smallest amount in 9 years. Wages and benefits paid to civilian workers rose last year by the smallest amount in 9 years. Now that's putting it positively, because if you actually read the article, you find out that when inflation is considered, overall compensation actually fell. 0.3%, the first time there's been a decline since '96. And when you read on further, you find out that this is actually all good news for the economy. The Federal Reserve is keeping a close watch on wage pressures. Given the strong growth in the labor market in the past 2 years, they're worried. While increases in the number of people working is good for the country, the concern at the Fed is that the economy could be growing so strongly that wage pressures will mount and trigger a rise in inflation. Well, we can't have that. CNN, just to reassure everybody, led off their story this way: real wages are having trouble keeping up with prices. First line, real wages are not exactly going through the roof. Who do you think they're writing for? The spinners love to tell us we're divided in this country, red v. blue.
And we are delighted tonight to be participating here with a panel of 4 people who I think exemplify in fabulous ways the challenging of the reigning assumptions. Laura Flanders, our moderator for tonight, is the host of Radio Nation on Air America. She is somebody who talks the talk as well as walking the walk, and she is both tremendously entertaining and a very, very serious host. She's also the author of Bushwomen, Tales of a Cynical Species, about women in the Bush administration, and is writing a new book actually, which is about the progressive victories in unusual places and what we can learn and take from them. So I'm delighted to have Laura Flanders as our host. Next to Laura, we have Paul. Next to Laura, we have someone you all know, who's Paul Krugman, who is the writer for the New York Times op-ed page. He's also a professor of economics and international affairs at Princeton University, most recently the author of The Great Awakening, which many of you have seen. But interestingly enough, as we were talking...
Close enough.
What?
Good enough for government work.
The Great Unraveling.
There we go.
Wake up, Miles.
I gave you even more credit.
There we go.
He spawned an entire era. Anyway, the great unraveling. My apologies. But back in 1989, Paul said that he was writing about inequality in a book that he wrote called The Age of Diminished Expectations, and really has been calling attention to this issue for a long time. Meiju Louis is a wonderful activist, advocate, author, organizational person from Boston. Meiju started her work as a hospital worker and a union activist at Boston City Hospital, was the first Asian American elected to president of a union local in Boston and perhaps elsewhere, and since 1995 has been the director for United for a Fair Economy. And people may know that United for a Fair Economy has done just incredible work on challenging the rollback, the repeal of the estate tax, really getting even people like Bill Gates Sr. and others to speak out about the need for the public structures that are supported by the tax dollars that people pay. So Meiju is the author of a forthcoming book called The Color of Wealth, which is coming out, published by the New Press very shortly, and she will be speaking tonight. And last but not least is Jim Lardner, who's the senior fellow at Demos on inequality issues, and who is the co-editor, along with David Smith, another senior fellow at Demos who is here tonight, of Inequality Matters. Jim really has been passionate and articulate on this issue for the last several years as a writer for the New York Times magazine and for many, many other publications, and actually founded a website called inequality.org, which has now become part of the Demos family. So we've got a great panel tonight. I guarantee you'll hear some things that